Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for the next hour. My name is John Powell, and I am the VP of Membership Development here at SIG, and I have the pleasure of facilitating today's SIG webinar entitled Hey 19, Procurement's Playbook for 2019, presented by our partners at Zycus. Today's webinar is meant to be interactive, so please submit your questions throughout the presentation by typing them in the Q&A box. We are going to hold them to the last 5 to 10 minutes, so please keep typing them throughout. We will do our best to answer all of your questions at the conclusion of the presentation. We'll be sharing the slides as well. Before I proceed, I do have a couple of housekeeping and counter items I would like to review with you. Global events in North America and the Asia Pacific region. Attend one of our signature events to share them with your colleagues. Please check the SIG website frequently for upcoming cities and current agendas. SIG webinars, you are actually on a webinar. We do those twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We also have the SIG peer-to-peer resource. You do not have to be a member to answer a peer-to-peer resource. However, submitting a peer-to-peer inquiry is a benefit of your SIG membership. SIG's Resource Center, you can access over 5,000 tools, templates, presentations, white papers, methodologies. We've got a whole host of items in there for you, so please feel free to use them. Our website also offers a career network with postings for sourcing professionals and internship opportunities for all levels of employment. We also have our Student Talent Outreach Program. This program was designed to find tomorrow's supply chain professionals today while students are still learning about the industry. Please reach out to me directly if you have any questions or would like more information about any of these programs. SIG has some global partnerships. We are excited to announce that we've established strategic partnerships with Bureau, GEP, Everest Group, and the Sourcing Industry Landscape podcast with Art of Procurement. Please reach out to a SIG team member for more information about how these partnerships will benefit you as a member of SIG. SIG has also partnered with Manu Technologies for the upcoming Impact Sourcing Summit in Uganda. For more information, please visit the website www.manutech.com. SIG's Global Executive Summits are semi-annual events with more than 350 decision makers in attendance. The agenda and details for our Spring Summit in Amelia Island, Florida are available on our website, and registration is now open. I am actually talking to you from Amelia Island, Florida today, where it is 68 degrees and beautiful. It's even better in April, so if you have a chance, please make it to that event. Here at SIG, we are trying to gain more of a global footprint, so please take a look at some of the upcoming global events on the SIG website under the Networking Events tab. If you have colleagues in any of these cities, please invite them to attend. We've got the Midwestern, Western, Eastern, and Northeastern Regional. Midwestern event is happening in Minneapolis, Minnesota, March 7th. We've got a full agenda, and there are sponsorship opportunities still available. Reach out to me directly after this call, and we can talk more about it. SIG University offers training and development opportunities to people of all levels in their sourcing careers. We are currently enrolling for the next semester of our Certified Sourcing Professional, Certified Supplier Management Professional, and the newly launched Third-Party Risk Management Professional courses beginning on April 15th. Please reach out to me directly as well after this webinar. I can give you more information, share the curriculum, and give you tuition options. So enough about me and SIG. Let me get you to the important part. Today is the content of this presentation. So once again, the title today is Hey 19, Procurement's Playbook in 2019, brought to us by our friends and partner, Zycus. So we do have 3 presenters today, and I am going to introduce you to all 3 of them. Quickly, we're going to start off with Richard Waugh. He is a VP of Corporate Development at Zycus. Richard has an extensive background in B2B e-commerce. He helped launch GE's TPN, the first-line marketplace for sourcing and procurement. Richard is the co-founder of B2E Markets, the first SaaS sourcing suite provider. He is also an industry analyst in supply management market for the Aberdeen Group. We also today have Chris Sawchuk. He leads Hackett's Global Procurement Advisory Practice. He has over 20 years of experience in supply management, working directly with Global 2000 and mid-sized companies around the globe and in a variety of industries to improve all aspects of supply management, including process redesign, technology enablement, operations strategy planning, organizational change, and strategic sourcing. He was also a judge at our Future of Sourcing Awards last year. He's a super smart guy, super nice guy. That's Chris from Hackett. And we also have Brittany Muirhead. She's a director of procurement at Brookdale. Brittany is an experienced procurement professional, skilled in managing $100 million categories, inventory controls, sales forecasting, and production planning. She has proven her ability in managing staff, developing and overseeing operating budgets. Brittany has more than 10 years of experience with sourcing suppliers for purchased goods and services, negotiating contracts, including blanket agreements and bulk commodity pricing agreements, and conducting production planning. Brittany currently serves as Director of Procurement at Brookdale Senior Living. Before that, she has served Mars Pet Care and Bridgestone Americas Holding, LLC. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over. Richard, it's all yours.
Well, thanks so much, John, and thanks everyone for joining today. I think we have a very informative program for you. And just before we launch into that, I'll just give you a little bit of a background on who Zycus is. Zycus, we're an integrated suite of source-to-pay software, and that spans sort of upstream or strategic procurement from spend analytics, sourcing, contract, and supplier management, as well as downstream or operational procurement in the procure-to-pay space. We've been recognized as leaders in the market, whether that's the Forrester Wave or Gartner Magic Quadrant, consistently identified as a top player, in fact, a leader in the space. So that's just a little bit about Zycus. But without further ado, I want to get into our session today. We're going to start off with Chris Sawchuk from the Hackett Group, who's going to share key insights from their 2019 Procurement Key Issues study. And we are early in 2019. It is still January after all, so a great time to kind of set the agenda for what's top of mind in the world of procurement and leaders in the space. And after Chris shares those insights, we're going to have a chance to have a conversation with Brittany. We'll call it a transformation talk, to get insights from a practitioner that's leading procurement transformation, at the ground level, to kind of get her insights as well. And as John mentioned earlier, we encourage you to submit your questions. We'll get to as many as we can at the end. But without further ado, Chris, I'd like for you to start us off by sharing those key insights from the 2019 Key Issues study.
Well, thank you, Richard. And I look forward to having the discussion today. And as Richard mentioned, sharing some of the insights from our latest Key Issues study. Some of you may be aware that on an annual basis, we conduct a study and really try to accumulate, what's top of mind, what are the top priorities, where are organizations, procurement and supply management organizations, building capabilities in their organization as we look at organizations, globally. And so I'm going to share some of those insights with you today. Now, there's a number of different areas I'm going to cover, but to begin with, what I really want to help understand is, what are some of those areas that we as procurement organizations are developing capabilities in our organizations to, really help us to, develop and, really adjust to and align to those enterprise priorities within our organizations. And, one of the things that we have here, and many of you have seen some of these slides in the past, but what you see here is basically a graph. And when you look at this graph, what you're looking at is two different dimensions. One is on the x-axis, what we're looking at are all of those priorities. So if you went from left or from right to left on this particular graph, you'd get an understanding as to the importance that organizations had put on some of these capabilities in order for them to be able to support the enterprise objectives within their companies, their organizations. And if you go looking at the y-axis, what you're looking at is this y-axis being focused on what do those organizations believe their ability to address these capabilities are. So if you look from right to left, the area that is the most critical and most important capability that organizations, and procurement organizations, see as their, critical area, for capability development to support the enterprise objectives of their companies is the area around improving their analytical capabilities within their organizations. But you also see other areas that are quite important to them. Areas like modernizing their applications and accelerating the adoption of software tools. But what I really want to refer you to is the area that is a little bit gray here, and we have several areas highlighted in red. Areas that I mentioned before, as I go back to improving our analytical capabilities, what you see, it's all the way over to the right. But when you look on the y-axis, and we ask organizations, it's very critical to you, but what do you believe your ability to address that area is? It's much more muted. And so when you look at all of these areas in the red and the gray, these are areas where organizations and procurement organizations believe that these are areas that are fairly critical and important to them, but they feel less confident about their ability to address them. And that includes the areas around not only, improving their analytical capabilities, but leveraging supplier relationship management capabilities, aligning the skills and talent of their organizations to those of the business, improving the customer centricity of their organizations, and really looking at some of these other types of areas, improving agility within their organizations as well. So if we go to the next slide here, one of the things that we're seeing is not just looking at what's important and what do I feel our ability to address them are, but where do we see procurement organizations having initiatives in place where they have improvement programs in place to increase their capabilities in these areas that were cited. And so what you see here is at the top of the list is modernizing their application platforms. So what we're seeing is not only is this an area that procurement organizations see quite critical to their success in 2019 in order to support the enterprise objectives, but it's also an area that they're investing. They actually have programs in place to develop these types of areas. And right behind that is the area around improving analytical capabilities. If you remember from the last slide, it was an area that was farthest to the right. It was the area that procurement organizations cited as the most critical area for development within and most important area in their organizations. But at the same time, we also see those same procurement organizations investing and actually have improvement programs in those areas. But that's not true with some of the other areas. In that red zone where we see areas that and capabilities that were cited to be more important than our abilities to address them are, we highlighted those here in C. And so what you see towards the bottom here, things like leveraging supplier relationship management. It was an area that procurement organizations identified as, fairly important to them as an organization, and not having a great ability to, or at least they didn't feel like they had the confidence in their ability to address these particular areas. But what we're finding is that these organizations, as we look into 2019, don't necessarily have, or a very small percentage, only about a fifth of the organizations, have a improvement program in place to improve these supplier relationship management capabilities. But you also see this in customer centricity. How do they put the customer, the stakeholder, more centric in their delivery models in terms of how they deliver their procurement and sourcing and supply management services to the organization, but also improving that agility within their organizations as well. Now, as we look at those key findings, there are several areas that, procurement addressed and ranked as these critical areas for development. And that's those areas I highlighted earlier that we showed in red, and I have them listed here from 1 to 5. What's interesting is that, in all of this, more than, a majority of the organizations rank all of these as an area that they have a lower ability to address, and that, 75% don't even have programs in place to address these types of areas. Now, the next thing I want to touch on is, what's really driving, some of these development areas within organizations. And what I want to do is back up and really look at things from an enterprise standpoint. In the same study that we did, we don't only look at procurement and what procurement and supply management organizations are doing and where they're focusing their investments and priorities, et cetera, but we also ask at an enterprise level above procurement. So we're looking across the enterprise. And one of the things that we've been asking over the last several years is, when you think about risks to your overall company, your organization, what do you see as the top risks, areas that are of high risk to your organization? And probably not surprising, cyber and information security is number one. We've seen that be number one over the last several years. But right behind that are three different areas. Access to critical talent, not just access to talent. We know that's challenging in some organizations, especially with the economy the way it is right now. Intensified competition, from other businesses, as well as disruptive innovation. The Ubers from 5 years ago, et cetera. These things are happening. And several years ago, over the last several years, we've seen all three of these right behind the focus of risk, in terms of cyber and information security. But one of the things that's interesting to happen this year is that access to critical talent has risen to number two. And more importantly, as we look out over the next 2 to 3 years, the increase in access to critical talent as a risk factor within our organizations is going to exceed the increase expected in our concern around the other areas. Another overall driver of some of these capabilities and the focus areas of our organizations and procurement is also this other driver. One of the things that we see through the study is that most organizations see their revenue growing in 2019. And you can see that on the left here in this particular slide. This is a blend of many different organizations across many different industries. And some of you are looking at this and say, listen, our revenue growth is expected to grow much higher than this, some much lower than this, sometimes in between. This is a blended, average of all of those different organizations. And so what we're seeing overall is that there is an expectation that revenue will continue to grow in 2019. But then we ask procurement organizations, what is the expectation when you look at your budgets in terms of adding headcount, staff to your organizations, as well as increasing the budgets, from an operating standpoint. And what you see is a much more muted increase in this area than what we see in the revenue growth. So what we do see is a continued focus on doing more for less, creating more scalability within our organizations. And also along the same lines as this driver number two is we also ask procurement organizations, where do you see some of your workforce and the workload moving as you consider the various locations that work could be performed within your organizations? And maybe not surprising, the highest areas of change, where we see more and more workload shifting is into the corporate procurement environments. But right behind that is into self-service types of environments, as well as into these centers that we have created, these new constructs around creating centers of excellence or centers of competency, as well as global business services or GBS constructs. Where we're not seeing as much movement is the movement of workload to offshore or even back into our businesses or even being outsourced to a third party. And this is something that we have seen over the last several years. So it's continuing on with some trends that we have seen, really percolate over the last several years as part of this study. But what I want to do now is really go into, how is procurement addressing these five big capability areas that I identified earlier on. And, just to remind us, the first one I'm going to go focus on is improving our analytical capabilities. One of the things that we did a study, a number of years ago, we really looked at, or not actually more recently, is really looking at the initiatives that procurement organizations have in place to really focus on analytics. So if we're going to improve our analytical capabilities, what are we doing around that? And what you see here is a number of different things on this particular slide. And I'm going to highlight 3 of these various initiatives. The first one is really the focus on creating an analytics center of excellence. And it's actually the area where we see the most dominance in terms of the percentage of organizations that actually have this in place and have completed their initiative in this particular area. And so, what we see is this is the area, and when you think about all of these various areas on the left, where we're focused on developing analytical capabilities within our organizations, the creation of a COE that centers some of that competency and that capability in our companies is something that's much more established than some of the other areas. The other thing is a whole focus on data stewardship and master data management. It's an area that, today what we're seeing is many organizations are focusing on this. They understand that to develop good analytical capabilities, and you got to have good data. And the foundation of having good data is having good master data, whether that be your supplier master data or whether it be your item master file data. And what we see is 73, almost 3/4 of organizations out there today have an ongoing initiative in terms of improving their master data within their organizations. And then the last point I want to make is the whole focus on AI, artificial intelligence and cognitive, predictive types of capabilities that organizations are looking at. And the point I want to show here, though we're not seeing organizations with completed initiatives here, we do see over 50% of organizations exploring these areas. Remember, these are some newer areas. Certainly there are organizations out there that have more developed capabilities in AI and cognitive, but it is an area that we see a predominance of many organizations that are exploring these types of areas as they look forward and developing these analytical capabilities within the organization, which we know is very important and critical for us as procurement organizations to support the enterprise objectives of our companies. The next area I want to touch on is aligning skills, and more specifically, aligning these skills with the changing business needs. We all know there's a lot of changing. And, one of the biggest changes that have been talked about over the last several years has been the digital transformation that is occurring within our functions, within our companies, across the enterprises that we work within. And a lot of the focus has been on the technology and what types of technology will be involved in that kind of environment. What are the things that we're seeing changing there? But the other thing that we have to consider is the impact that these technology changes are going to have on the skills and talent of our organizations. And this is a slide, in the middle of it, you can see a person, and this is the procurement person or a supply management professional. And you're looking at that individual as being somebody that's more agile, somebody that is looked at as a trusted advisor, a business advisor to the organization, all of the stakeholders that it enables to be successful. And as we look forward and we look out, 3, 5, 10 years out there, as we look at a world that's much more digitally enabled than maybe where we are today, and in that environment, what's the impact and what becomes important when we think about skills within that individual? And what I have here is a number of areas that we believe, and through a lot of research that we've done, that we believe become much more important as we consider some of the activities that go away as we look forward. What's left? And what's left, what types of skills are going to be necessary to really enable us to be successful? One of the things I want to point out here is in the upper left. And it's really following up on the last capability I talked about, is improving our analytical capabilities and the whole focus on data analysis and modeling. The future is not necessarily having individuals and having a spend analytics person, et cetera. We're looking at organizations where every single procurement professional needs to have a capability in data analysis and modeling. I'm not saying that every individual has to be able to work with Python and R and all these, very, sophisticated analytical types of tools. What I am saying is that we all have to be comfortable in this environment. And we are seeing a much more of an emergence of really highly skilled, specialized data scientists within organizations, many of them having PhDs in this particular area. But what makes talent management different? the thing that I want to highlight here, there's a lot of, words on here in terms of the impact and what it really makes it, important, et cetera, whether it be retention and recruitment, et cetera. But the point I really want to make is, what does it matter? And one of the things that we did is we did a study in terms of where we correlated, talent management best practices, where we see organizations employing, the best practices when we look at talent management, true world-class talent management practices. And some of them are highlighted above here. And what we wanted to do is correlate that. Do we see a correlation between having these types of practices within organizations and the performance of those companies? And what we saw was there was absolutely a correlation, whether that be in return on equity, profit margins, EBITDA, et cetera. We saw a correlation, a positive correlation with improved talent management capabilities and improved performance of organizations. The third area that we highlighted, and I highlighted earlier in terms of critical development areas, was the whole focus on improving customer centricity. How do we make the customer become much more centric in everything that we go do? As you think about that and you go through a lot of, there's processes that organizations go do. One is, if you're going to improve your stakeholder experience, one of the things that you have to consider is, do I do that with every single stakeholder? The answer is, you don't have the time. There's not enough time, or you don't have enough resources to do that. Same thing with suppliers. We segment our supply base for reasons, because we want to understand which suppliers are more important to our organization, more strategic to us, and that's where we want to invest our time. Others, we're going to treat them a little bit different and engage with them a bit different, but we're going to segment to align our capabilities in the appropriate amounts to each of these different segments of our supply base. The same thing has to be said for our stakeholders. Those individuals and those, capabilities within the organization and organizations within our companies, how do we decide on which ones are most important, which ones are most influential, where we need to spend time with? And we need to get insights from them in terms of what is, how can we improve what we go do? But more than that, it's not just about getting information and doing surveys. It's about following up on that. Too often I see organizations gather all of this information and they don't go back to their stakeholders to tell them what they found out. Here's what we found out. Let me tell you what we're doing about it. Once you do it, let me tell you what we did, and let me tell you what we're going to go do next. It's a continuous journey. And the thing that I want to point out on the right is that what we see in organizations, a small percentage of organizations, around 20%, actually have a formal or explicit stakeholder customer management capability within their organization today. Most, it's embedded. Either they don't have it and they don't focus on it, or it's really just embedded in some of the processes like their sourcing processes, but they don't see it as an overall capability for the organization. And today, it's not just about the efficiency and the effectiveness of our organizations. It's also about the experience that we're creating for our stakeholders, our little c customers, and engage with the capability that we build. Interestingly, when we went out and we did a survey of organizations in terms of, are you using these B2B marketplaces, the open B2B marketplaces that are out there today? And the point I want to highlight here is we asked organizations, are you getting benefit from them? Some said no, and some said yes, they are. But we asked them, if you are getting benefit, where are you seeing that benefit? And the highest area where people said, yes, I'm getting a benefit, was improving their internal customer satisfaction. Now, the next area in critical development areas is a whole area around improving our agility as an organization. And as we look at that, one of the things I try to tell organizations that, digital transformation is a key strategy for improving our organizational agility. It's understanding, what does agility really mean? And when I talk to most organizations, when they tell me, what do they believe agility is? It's about flexibility. It's about being more responsive. But what they tend not to focus on is it's also about being predictive. it's not only responding and being quicker and having a velocity in the organization, but it's also about getting ahead of the game, being more predictive in your capabilities as an organization. So as we think about that agility, what does digital transformation do to allow us to actually achieve that agility within our organizations? Digital transformation, as we like to say, it's not just about the technology. It certainly is about doing new things in new ways, but it's also about customer centricity. It's about designing the model, that operating model, that service delivery model that you're designing for your supply management organization, designing that from the outside in, designing it from the perspective of the customer, and understanding what is that experience that they need to enable them to be successful in what they're actually trying to go do. And lastly, it's about velocity. People don't have time to wait. It's about, the perspectives around fail fast, fail forward, et cetera. But it's about a velocity in terms of how we actually engage and move these things and transform along. Lastly, in terms of critical development areas, is the whole focus on leveraging supplier relationship management. I spend a lot of my time working with organizations on either designing a new capability and helping them in designing a new capability, or fixing a capability that they tried to create and it wasn't successful. We realize that supplier relationship management has always been important in organizations. But what we have to understand is that we have to continue to evolve our practices here, as we look forward. Today, most organizations are focused on, and again, there are still many that are challenged on this, and understanding that SRM is really an enterprise-wide. It's not a procurement capability. It is an enterprise-wide capability, and it's coordinated across the enterprise. That we have to use much more broad and holistic measurement systems as we think about the performance that's actually being driven out of there, and also understand that we're not going to be able to focus on every single supplier that we have. It's not meant to do that. It's meant to, what I was saying before, to focus on those that we segment and determine to be the most strategic to us and important to us as an organization. But it's also focusing on how we, as procurement professionals, can be better customers. How do we get that voice of the supplier embedded in terms of our models, in terms of how we design it? But as we look forward, there are other objectives that we have to focus on. And whether that, becoming much more, engaged in terms of how we facilitate suppliers and their engagement with our organizations, whether that be through supplier advisory boards, which I've seen organizations utilize to a high degree of success, in terms of extracting the ideas and technologies that these suppliers have, their capabilities, and embedding them and using them to enable those companies to be much more successful. Coming up with a way that we can sort out how do we explicitly gain share and share in the successes that we have in these relationships, but at the same time understanding that technology is needed to enable this to be long-term, sustainable, and successful. Things like creating collaborative workplaces, that suppliers and buyers can come together to work within. Certainly the portals that have been around, but really, the term we use is creating a CRM, customer relationship management for SRM, supplier relationship management functionality for our organizations. Now, what I want to end with is really just a couple of slides to really highlight, the impact of digital transformation. One of the first things that we asked organizations is, what do you believe the impact on you as a supply management procurement organization on your ability to achieve a number of different areas, and what impact do you believe that digital transformation is going to have on you in actually, being able to address these different areas? The first one is the achievement of the enterprise objectives. Why do we exist as a sourcing and procurement organization? It's to help our enterprise and enable them to achieve their objectives. And what organizations are saying today, about a third of them see that, it's having a very high impact on them. But as we look out 2 to 3 years, now we're looking at 60% of organizations saying, yes, we believe we may not be there today, but as we look out, it is going to have a significant impact as we think about digital transformation within our function and it's our ability to achieve these enterprise objectives. But we also asked other areas, procurement performance, as well as procurement service delivery model, our ability, in terms of optimizing that procurement service delivery model, whether it's our technology, our processes, our people, our organization, the structure, et cetera, that the impact is going to be over 70% of a very high impact from the digital transformation that we will be engaged in as an organization. The one area that I want to point out is the last one. Today, when we look at the roles and skills and needs of our procurement organizations, today about a third of organizations see that digital transformation is going to have a very high impact on the skills, the roles that we have within our supply management organizations. But as we go out, we only see that rising to about 56%. Now, I stated earlier, and I highlighted some of those impacts that we're going to see on the skills that are necessary to be successful as we look forward. And what I didn't highlight are some of the roles and the new roles that we see, coming out and emerging as we look forward as well. What I do believe is happening here is that until organizations really digest and they see the impact of digital transformation on some of these other areas, will they fully understand the impact that it potentially could have on them in terms of their roles and the talent within the organization. And so if we go to the last slide and to really sum up some of the things I've said, as we look forward and we think about, again, this impact of digital transformation, one is this whole idea of strategic maturity. When we ask organizations, procurement organizations with a digital transformation strategy in place and executing today, do you have a strategy in place today? And today we're seeing almost 60% of organizations say they have a strategy in place. 2 to 3 years, almost, basically 100%, they will have a strategy in place. As we say, is that strategy aligned with the enterprise? Today, about 2/3. Future, 100% basically. Do you have the competencies today to do that? About 1/3 say they have the competencies. But as we look forward, almost 90% believe they will have those things, and they'll have the competencies and the enablement from the IT organization technologies. Going forward, significantly more capability in terms of enabling their success in procurement. So with that, I've shared with you some of the insights that we've gleaned from our latest 2019 Key Issue Study. And so with that, Richard, I'm going to turn it over to you to carry on.
Well, thanks so much, Chris. I think you've really set the stage for us here in helping to understand what's on the agenda for the procurement playbook in 2019. It's clear that there's a lot on the plate. Digital transformation really came right to the top of the list in the information that you shared with us. I think it's a great segue for my chance to have a little transformation talk with Brittany Muirhead, the Director of Procurement Strategy at Brookdale Senior Living. So we'll kind of talk about how does assisted sourcing drive the digitization and transformation roadmap for Brookdale. And I want to start with any transformation journey. Best place is always at the beginning, I think, Brittany. So and starting at the beginning is really to say, let's get a way to assess when you first started on this transformation journey with Brookdale, what were your top pain points? And we've kind of summarized some of those here, but I wanted to get your perspective on, kind of drawing out those pain points. What were you faced with when you initially started?
Thanks, Richard. Glad to be here. I would say the number one key challenge that I faced at Brookdale and in other organizations was change management. The willingness to change to new processes and be open to the benefits that more time and more visibility would bring to any procurement practitioner. We tend to get stuck in I've always done it this way and I've been successful. Why do you really want me to change mentality? That change management seems to be the number one key challenge and sticks out in my mind.
Absolutely, and I know you had shared with me the fact that your ability to influence spend was somewhat limited, that there's this win locally culture, so there's always this tension between a more centralized approach versus decentralized approach, and challenges just in terms of spend visibility and those kinds of things. I wanted to get a sense, too, before you started, we talked so much about digitization. What tools did you have at your disposal, and where did you see the biggest gaps in your procurement technology infrastructure?
Absolutely, and I don't want to gloss over the win locally culture that you mentioned. I think in every business, the decentralization versus centralization approach is always a struggle, and it continues to be one at Brookdale, finding the right place and the right influence and where we want procurement to help and where procurement wants to help. It's a very fine balancing act with any and all stakeholders. Speaking of traditional tools, we've used the tried and true Office suite, Excel, PowerPoint. We've had some other tools that didn't work quite as well as we wanted them to, and they weren't mature, so we stopped using them. What I've seen in most organizations, and Brookdale is no different, is that the traditional tools, Excel, PowerPoint, to some extent, access databases or pulling data out of your ERP system, but really not being able to glean any insights or slice and dice the data you exactly want to. Some of our other gaps have been around the navigation and validation of the data, knowing where you got the data, remembering what the data is telling you and trying to articulate it to your stakeholders, validating it against external data you may have gotten from your suppliers. I found that that's been super challenging in Brookdale, and that feeds back into the change management. We have this tool to use, but we've always gotten our data from our suppliers. And how do we know the tool has the right data?
Right, it's not the best position to be in, to rely on the kindness of strangers or the veracity of suppliers, maybe. So, and just to give our audience a sense here, we've got our painometer here, Brittany. Hopefully you weren't at the 9 to 10 unbearable pain level, but where would you say you were when you started out?
I would say we were in the 5 to 6, primarily for our sourcing and category managers. Maybe for the folks on our analytics team, they were in the 7 to 8. But again, we tended, if we couldn't find the data or we didn't believe the data, we tended to just go get external data and not be able to validate it and say it was good enough.
Awesome. Okay. So, well, in any case, enough pain that it was a catalyst for change. And, I think one way to look at and assess the situation is this kind of more introspective view of what pain does procurement currently feel. But I think it's important, and Chris teed up some of this perspective, to kind of look a little bit outside of the procurement function and into the stakeholders' perspective and what their perception of procurement is. And this is some of Chris's data from Hackett as well. No surprise that when you ask about the desired state, I think 87% here said they would like to be viewed as business partners or procurement experts, whereas only about 50% would say they're there today. So what would you say before you started your transformation journey? What was the perception of procurement amongst the stakeholders within your enterprise?
I would say it tended to be definitely between the gatekeeper and the administrator. We were seen as either the no police or the last stop before the contract went out the door. And that's not, no organization, especially procurement practitioners, we really don't want to be there. So we are focused and continue to focus on changing the perception to a value business partner. We've made really good strides at becoming that, and the data that we have available and that digitization that we continue to talk about has definitely helped underpin and helped us recreate our image. We want our stakeholders to seek our input as procurement practitioners, invite us to the table very early in the process. Most people who've been practicing procurement for quite a while know that being early to the game is really where you're able to influence what the end result's going to look like. That's where you're able to derive most of your negotiation power.
Well, that's great, Brittany. And let's talk a little bit about that data-driven, analytics-based approach because, as Chris stressed earlier, that's an area cited as a critical development need, but many organizations feel like they're not quite able to address it the way they'd like to today. And again, I'll borrow some of Chris's data here that contrasts the fact that top performers, world-class performers, typically have much better visibility from an analytics standpoint to spend data, either at the supplier level or at a line item level. And, I think you've really stressed that was a starting point in your transformation. So how did your spend visibility when you started out compare to some of these benchmarks, or at least in terms of where you wanted to be in gaining analytic visibility to spend?
Historically, we were in the limited information group, not knowing exactly what we were buying from certain suppliers. Therefore, you can't really drive compliance to the right vendor because you have no idea what you're buying. You just know you're buying from that vendor. We've made a lot of progress to move to the significant information group. Citing that, we still have some pockets of information that's limited. We don't have line-level detail on all of our invoices. We are actively working on that. We've partnered with several business functions around Brookdale to say this is an area of focus, getting that spend visibility. It helps us with our leverage. It helps us identify where we have compliance issues. So we are addressing those outliers actively.
Sounds like great progress in that area. And, of course, spend analytics and spend visibility is a means to an end, typically to be able to prioritize and pinpoint much better opportunities for strategic sourcing. So let's talk about sourcing for a moment. Again, I've got some great Hackett benchmark data that kind of says that, if you're measuring or benchmarking the sourcing process according to cycle times, there's wide variability. It could be, 1 to 10 days for tactical type sourcing projects, but 30 to 100 days for more complex type engagements as an example. So let's talk about your sourcing process. What kind of cycle times did you experience? What were some of the choke points in the process?
So our cycle times tend to be in line with the tactical and lower event complexity. Those are less complex categories in general. When you get to the medium and high event complexities, that's where you started to see our cycle time really extend. We just didn't have the data, didn't have the access to formulate what type of event, what do we want to do with the category. It became very challenging. We are starting to trend in that medium and high complexity category. We're starting to trend more along the averages and the benchmarks, and that is our goal, is to be well within the benchmark and the average data that you see here.
Absolutely. So, we've talked a lot about digital transformation in procurement, and again, there's some helpful information here courtesy of Chris and team at the Hackett Group that looks at some of the value drivers in crafting a business case for digital transformation. I think it's interesting when you look at some of the top performers here that tend to focus, in fact, more on some of the more intangibles, whether that's customer satisfaction, agility, or quality, than even the measurables, let's say, quantified business value and ROI, or cycle time reduction or operating cost reduction. Not to say that those aren't important, but I think it does highlight the fact that there are, beyond just the dollars and cents, there are some strategic business objectives that are encompassed in a business case for digital transformation. So in looking at some of this, I'd be interested in your insights, Brittany. What were some of the key drivers in putting together your business case to change the way you're doing things, to transform procurement?
I think that while the tangibles that you mentioned are always top of mind, I do think that we focus on more of the intangible benefits. So shortening the cycle times, driving and creating the most value for the business. You know, that is the essential role of procurement at this point, is value creation for your business, showing why you're around, what you do, and how well you do it. And then having the data to drive both the agility and the value to go faster, to drive more value. Those are really where we tended to focus, and we tend to focus there. We feel for our organization that the more agility we show the organization, we can transition easily, we can learn very quickly. That helps us when we drive the value as we take on more and more categories under management, and we learn more about categories that we're not familiar with.
Oh, that's terrific. And, of course, typically the business case, the purpose for it is to get approval to invest in new technologies, for example. So I'd be curious, as you looked at this process, what were some of the key criteria you applied in evaluating and selecting technology for the purpose of transformation?
Absolutely. And I don't know if you guys remember what Chris said about analysts being able to run their own data. We're seeing that we want more of a self-service model in his presentation. Brookdale definitely adopted that. We wanted ease of use and intuitiveness. Can our users self-service, and do they know what they're doing without a long, drawn-out training process? While we do have data scientists around Brookdale, we also want to balance it with our procurement category and sourcing managers and our analysts being able to run their own data, to analyze the data that comes out while being underpinned by more of a data expert.
Absolutely. And, you know, as we talk about this business case here, Brittany, the consumers, or at least the judge and jury for a business case, are usually the C-suite who would have to sign off on that business case and, in fact, have to endorse it fully to drive the successful adoption. So I'd be curious, as you look at some of these key C-suite level stakeholders, what were the hot button issues that you wanted to make sure to address with these kind of C-suite executives?
Absolutely. Our CIO was very in tune with connectivity to our existing platforms. Does it connect? How hard is it to connect? What happens if the connection breaks? How will IT support those connections? What work do you need from an overbooked and overscheduled IT group? What support do you need? Those are really his along with his support team who support procurement, those are really the majority of their focus. From a CFO perspective, no surprise to anyone on the phone, it's all about cost and value. What are we going to get as that ongoing value? How much is it going to cost me to get you the ongoing value? And then from a CPO perspective, it's the adoption rate. Will procurement adopt easily? What savings or compliance will we drive, and can you sustain it? Are we going to continue to use the tools? Everybody was very supportive of the tools, but the long-term view is what everybody was focused on.
I think great insights, Brittany, to help folks who may just be at this stage now to anticipate those hot button issues and have compelling answers for each. And as we talk about transforming source to pay and digital transformation overall, for many organizations, a big bang approach is probably not going to work just because of resource or budget constraints or overall change management. So here's a model that Gartner offers as kind of a best practice way to sequence, starting with spend visibility to really formulate sourcing strategies, then be able to execute those through e-sourcing, driving compliance through tools like Procure to Pay, and ultimately supply-based management, sort of the ongoing life cycle of supplier relationship management. So be curious to see in your roadmap, how does your approach either marry up with this or differ to this kind of best practice approach?
On the whole, we marry quite nicely with what Gartner has put out. I would say that we had a couple of tools in place that weren't performing the way we wanted. Our spend analytics was an area that left a lot to be desired. So we did go back as part of our transformation and start with spend analytics. We have the data. We are nurturing the data. It's an ongoing process. Next up, you're probably going to see some investment in that e-sourcing area to revitalize what's going on in that area. Because we had some of the tools on here, we're still managing and driving compliance. We don't ever want to take our eyes off of that area, especially with some of our decentralized or local sourcing projects and areas. We always have to keep our eye on that from a procurement perspective in the Brookdale environment. Other businesses might not be as challenged with that, but for Brookdale, that's really where we continue to be challenged in that compliance area as well.
Right. It definitely sounds like you've made significant progress along this transformation journey, Brittany, but it is a journey, right? It's ongoing and perhaps never complete. Maybe always reinventing yourself. I just wanted to make sure we had a chance to kind of tie this together. And again, I'll borrow one of your frameworks here, Chris. What digital transformation means for procurement, and in Hackett's model, as we can see here, number one, procurement digital transformation has to underpin and support an enterprise-wide business strategy, because all your counterparts in other functional domains are looking at how to digitize and transform the enterprise as a whole. And I think we've established, as shown here, that the foundational layer is analytics-driven insights. And then built upon that foundation, these pillars of having a more personalized or omnichannel stakeholder experience, digitally enabling the procurement workforce, using AI and cognitive tools to invoke a more smart orchestration of source-to-pay services, and tying all this together, as you mentioned, Brittany, the CIO, making sure that whatever you deployed was going to integrate with and actually leverage and augment your existing technology infrastructure. So I want you to kind of bring us all together for us, Brittany, and how does procurement's role evolve in this era of digital transformation?
In the era of digital transformation, I see procurement starting to help shape the strategies and shake off the view that we are just the contract reviewer. That movement from administrator or gatekeeper to valued business partner is really where Brookdale is focused. I suspect a lot of other organizations are focused there, really helping to shape the strategy so that the practitioner understands what they're buying, so that as they're going into their negotiations or their sourcing events against their suppliers or their supply base, they know where to push, where to pull, where to concede. Not that we like to concede, but you know where those concession points are should you need them. Really
great perspective.
And Brittany,
John, I was just going to turn it back. Our transformation talk could go on all day, but I know we don't have all day, so I wanted to. I think Brittany put the exclamation point on our session, and turn it to you to wrap us up.
Well, thank you. I do want to thank Richard, Brittany, and Chris for sharing their insights. It was a very, very informative webinar. And as we speak, we are going to be sharing the slides. You will see them coming out. So I do want to thank you once again. At SIG, when we tell you an hour, we do say it is going to be an hour, so we do have a hard stop. Otherwise, we do have questions in queue. So If you did ask a question, we will give it to our presenters, and I'm sure they will get back to you in a short amount of time. So you can see the slides coming out now. Everybody's contact information is on the slide. So once again, thank you to our presenters. This will conclude today's webinar. So we look forward to connecting with you again soon. If you do want to download the please click on the link inside the pop-up box. And you also receive a follow-up email tomorrow from SIG, including a link to the recording. So again, thank you all for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.